Da venter vi litt grann. Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this book launch where author and senior researcher at NUPI, Dr. Pernille Rieker, who by the way did a very good figure at Urix last night, commenting French politics. She will present her new book on French foreign policy in a changing world, Practising Grandeur. My name is Kate Hansen-Bundt, and I'm the chair of the board here at NUPI, as well as the Secretary General of the Norwegian Atlantic Committee and an expert on German politics. And we also have with us Professor Frédéric Charion from the University of Auvergne. He just flew in from Paris 1 hour ago. This in order to comment and discuss this highly timely book and topic with us. And he are flying back this afternoon. So we will have to end this book launch exactly at 3:30. Welcome to Oslo, Professor. It's your first time here. It's really a pity that you don't have more time. Just a few practicalities before I give the floor to Pernille Rieker, who is going to talk more about her book. The book can, in fact, be bought from palgrave.com with a 20% discount, but you need to pick up the flyers over there, which give you the necessary code in order to get the rebate. I'm also asked to inform you that this seminar will be streamed, so you really have to behave this afternoon. Then, Pernille, the floor will be yours in a second. You have really chosen an excellent week to present your new book on French foreign policy, given the German elections and President Macron's speech yesterday on Europe. We are really looking forward to your introduction, and you will all, of course, get the opportunity to pose questions afterwards. Please come up to the podium. Give her a big hand.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to all of you who have come to this book launch. And a special thanks to Professor Frédéric Charion, one of the leading experts on French foreign policy, or the leading expert on French foreign policy, who has come all the way from France this morning to give his comments. I really appreciate that. I know that many of you are interested in what French foreign policy will be like under Emmanuel Macron. And even though the manuscript for this book was finalized before Macron was elected, I will argue that this book will also help you to better understand the current French foreign policy, as well as how it is likely to develop in the future, at least in the near future. And the main reason for this is that there are some important elements of continuity in French foreign policy. And this does not mean that there are no changes, but that there are some underlying factors that, in my view, are guiding French foreign policy and have also done so for quite some time. And the key word here is, of course, grandeur. The book investigates how France has adapted to both external and internal developments over the past 15 to 20 years. And I've called the book French Foreign Policy in a Changing World, Practising Grandeur. The subtitle, Practising Grandeur, points to the fact that I'm not only studying the political discourse, but also political practices, or how policy is implemented. And this opens up for study changes that are not necessarily apparent in political declarations or in official documents. With this book, I therefore try to overcome an old problem in foreign policy analysis, that is to be able to put weight on both the importance of structures, such as identity and history, and the importance of agency or actors, like preferences or profiles of political leaders, their advisors, etc. During the past 20 years, French influence and status in international politics has been challenged on several levels. At national level, France was weakened by years with low level of economic growth, high level of unemployment, increasing social frictions as a result of an increasing polarized society, and a number of serious terror attacks. At the European level, France has gradually also lost its traditional leading position. This is partly due to its weakened national economy, of course, but also reinforced by both the enlargement of the EU and a strengthened role, or the relative strengthening position of Germany in Europe. But also at the global level, France has also seen its status being challenged. First, as a direct consequence of its weaker position in Europe, but also more generally by global power shifts and emerging powers. But for France, this weakened role led in many ways to a kind of what I would call a collective or national depression in France. And a number of academic books has also been written about this period of French decline, why it happened, and how to restore French greatness. And I will also argue that this loss of status has been harder to accept for the French than for many other, or for France than for many other countries. And the reason for this is that the French, as I read them, see it as part of their national identity to be a great power or to play a global role. The French see their role as something exceptional and something unique. And this exceptionalism is rooted in the role France has played in history, of course, and especially, in particular, in developing universal principles and norms. So the idea of grandeur is something deeply French, as I see it. De Gaulle has, of course, been the most explicit in highlighting the notion of grandeur. He argued that La France ne peut pas être France sans grandeur. France cannot be France without greatness. And for non-French, this can easily be dismissed as a cliché or something of the past. But this is actually deeply rooted in France, way beyond de Gaulle. And it is not difficult to find similar quotes from more or less all French presidents since de Gaulle. And as you see here, both Hollande and Macron has also expressed this. And in this book, I argue that the concept of status seeking is a powerful tool for understanding French foreign policy, but also that it has taken a different form in different periods since the end of the Second World War. For instance, after the Second World War, France was also in a very weak position. De Gaulle's ambition then was to make France a natural member of the club of the winning parties, and he also succeeded. In spite of its weakness at the time, France became one of the permanent members of the UN Security Council. During the Cold War, the strategy was to play a leading role through the development of a strong and French-led European integration process, what we could call the Europeanization strategy, but also by ensuring independence between the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. And this led to a French foreign policy that was often interpreted as anti-American. And finally, after the end of the Cold War, there was a window of opportunity for this kind of French-dominated Europe. And we saw also a boost in the integration process with the French-German leadership at the core. And what followed was the establishment of political union, Euro, the first initiative for a strong European security and defense cooperation, the enlargement process, etc. But with this, the challenges that I just mentioned also came creeping, both at the national, the regional, and the global level. And French role in international affairs and in Europe was gradually weakened. And this was something the French were not really prepared for. So based on this background, the question that I ask in the book is the following. Has France now abandoned its ambition of playing a global role? Has it accepted a new role as a middle power? Or has the global ambition of status-seeking just taken a new and a different form? As you probably already have understood from the title and from my introduction, I argue for the latter, that French foreign policy has not left its traditional ambition of grandeur, but that this has taken a new form. And this new form is characterized, as I see it, by increased emphasis on symbolic power and cultural capital rather than material power. This means that French political leaders have, since around the turn of the millennium, been increasingly preoccupied by promoting themselves as defender of the liberal order, liberal values. This also comes natural as they genuinely believe that these values have their origin from France, with reference to the French Revolution and the Enlightenment. I argue that this approach is also particularly evident from 2003 onwards, first with the heated dispute over whether or not to intervene in Iraq, where France took a principled position in opposition to the Bush administration in the US. But we have seen this turn in many other domains as well. And it has also become even more obvious recently with Macron's handling of Putin, Brexit, and Trump. In many ways, there seemed to be a window of opportunity for France to return to the global scene as the defender of the liberal order that is increasingly being threatened. And Macron also seemed particularly eager and clever to take advantage of this opportunity. But what does this really mean? Does it mean that France has suddenly become normative power? Not necessarily. At least not more than other liberal democracies. My argument is first and foremost that this is a strategic choice, as it is seen as the only way that France can play a global role in a changing world. The book gives an overall account of French foreign policy and how it has developed over the past 20 years. But I also apply this perspective on 5 different case studies. I studied the changes in French foreign policy towards Africa, French policy towards Russia, French-US relations, French NATO policy, and French counterterrorism policy. I will not go into details for all these chapters because that would take too long, and we can come back to some of that in the discussion. But I would just say that the symbolic power approach that I argue is kind of the most dominant in French foreign policy today is most obvious in the first 3 cases, on French Africa policy, French Russia policy, and in French-US relations. In relation to the 2 cases on security policy, French NATO policy and French approaches to counterterrorism, the symbolic power turn is perhaps less obvious. Here France is playing a key role first and foremost due to its competence and capacities. France is Europe's main military power and has also shown willingness to use this capacity. It has also long experience and competence in counterterrorism measures and intelligence, and this is also respected by many countries, including by the US. While reference to symbolic power can be found also here in these cases, the policy change in these areas are perhaps more or better characterized by an increasing pragmatism, with a decision to return to the integrated military structures in NATO, and an increasing willingness to promote international cooperation also in the fight against international terrorism. But still, what all cases show is that there has been an important change in French foreign policy practices, and also that it is still guided by this steering wheel of French foreign policy, namely the specific eager to regain or maintain position as a great power. But how does then France manage to uphold this global role, given its weaknesses that I mentioned earlier? And what is it with the French society or political system that makes this possible? Because it's of course not enough to just have the ambition of being a great power. The explanation for this, as I see it, is that there are some specific characteristics of the French nation state that facilitates such a continued policy of grandeur. And in the book I refer to these as status indicators. First, there is, as I mentioned, in France, a profound belief that there is a historical legitimacy for its global role. And secondly, France has also, during the Fifth Republic, developed a set of strong centralized political institutions. It has a highly competent civil service and also a capacity. The centralization makes it the capacity to make decisions rapidly, also a feature of the Fifth Republic, at least when it comes to foreign policy. Third, the national representation also at the core of important international institutions is of course crucial, both in the UN Security Council and at the core of the EU and other international institutions. And finally, it has also strong instrument for deployment of both hard and soft power, and also the willingness to use them. France is Europe's most important military power, as I mentioned, but it also has a competent diplomatic corps, including cultural diplomacy, with a global outlook, which is not so easy to find in other countries. So to conclude, of that size at least, so to conclude, just move to the conclusion. In this, the key argument in this book is then that French exceptionalism, or what I refer to as grandeur, is still a key feature of contemporary French foreign policy. But France can no longer play this global role based on its representation in core international organization or its material power only, as it has done in the past. Projection of symbolic power and cultural capital is now increasingly seen as the only way to regain international status. And this is also why French foreign policy practice has become increasingly guided by multilateral, an explicit reference to multilateralism and respect for international norms. This has been the dominant feature of French foreign politics since the early 2000s, but has also been gradually intensified and is now even more evident with Macron. And it has been particularly evident in his recent speeches, both to his own diplomatic corps now in August, in his speech he held in UN General Assembly, and yesterday in his speech at Sorbonne. So what we see is a new kind of confidence in France after years of pessimism. And with Macron, it's also we see a new generation of political leadership. We have also seen several important initiatives in his first month as president. Meetings with Trump, Putin, the French-German elections, French-German's relations, several initiatives to strengthen European integration, and more will come on this, and we heard a lot about that in his speech yesterday. And he has also taken initiative to dialogue between parties in Libya. So and this is only in the first few months. But the difference between Hollande and Macron, because we haven't seen so much of how the policy practices yet when it comes to Macron, is more in the discourse. So the difference between Hollande and Macron, as I read it, is not first and foremost the content of their policy, because we see a lot of these changes in how Hollande has practiced his foreign policy, especially in the Africa policy, also his change towards Russia. So here we can find this change also in practices. But the difference between the two is more in style and approach, as I see it. Macron has the willingness to take on the leadership and to follow up with action, at least it seems so. And he genuinely believes, it seems, that he will succeed. And this also makes him more convincing. So what is interesting now is if he managed to kind of keep up and to meet the challenges that he is very likely to meet when he's going to move from kind of vision to implement his policy and concrete policy practices. So thank you so much. This was my presentation. I will end just with the book. And thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for coming. I will give the floor to Professor Frédéric Charillon, who will give his comments before we will have a discussion. So Frédéric, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pernilla. Thank you very much for inviting me, and let me just tell you how happy I am to be with you today, because I know the dynamic and all the works of this institute and the works of Pernilla too, and it's very we meet at last, because I knew your works, and we wrote to each other, but it's the first time that we really have the time to, well, the time was not that we really meet actually, and I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy also because it's a very useful, I'm not because I'm invited that I say it, but it's a really useful book, and probably one of the best books on French foreign policy in the last years. Very complete, with many insights and many questions of political science. So it's probably a book that the decision makers in France would find right and exact and precise, and it's probably a book that the students will find useful, not only for France but for the study of foreign policy and international relations in general. So it's really another pleasure for me to comment on this book and to be here with you to discuss it. A few remarks on the book, and a few comments very shortly, because I guess that what's important is to have the time to talk all together and to have a discussion. The book raises a very flattering question for us French, which is, does France still count? And by writing a book, your answer is yes, otherwise you wouldn't have written a book. And so it's a first very nice point for us. It's a question that could be extended to all the European powers, the middle rank powers, the former powers, France, Germany, and the UK mostly, not only, but especially those middle rank powers. And so it's a key question, because what's left of those foreign policies, of what's left of those three middle rank powers, France, Germany, the UK, are not, do not have the possibility to be seen as superpowers anymore. They cannot compete with the biggest powers. It's over, probably for forever or for a good deal of time. But they are not any kind of power. They still keep important influence leverages, networks in international organizations, regional organizations, the EU, not for the British anymore, but they are not any kind. They are not small powers. So there is a real question of political science. What is their room to maneuver exactly? What kind of power are they? And this book addresses this point. Another question, which is very deeply present in the book, is the question of the level of analysis. To understand the foreign policy of a country, what do you have to look at? Do you have to look at the actors? Do you have to look at the decision process? Do you have to look at the state of the international system and the position of the state in the international system? And the book tries to address all those questions, all those levels, which raises many theoretical questions in international relations. And this is another bigger set of this book. And of course, there is an underlying question, which is what kind of theory of international relations does France illustrate? Is it a typical example of realism, realist international relations? Is it an example of constructivist theory with the role, the perceptions, symbolic power, the perceptions by France of his own role in the world, and so on? Maybe also we could discuss the transnational theory, because after all, there are many links between France and other parts of the world, especially Africa and North Africa, which have a lot to do with transnational networks. It's a question of international relations theory too. I would say that you have shown the basic hypothesis. You made the perfect summary of French foreign policy when you wrote that the French power politics or statute seeking seems to have been built around several key elements, and you gave us the list of those elements: historical legitimacy for its global role, institutions, efficient institutions, and civil servants, representation at the core of key global and regional institutions, and so on. I think this chapter is the perfect summary and synthesis of what can be written on French foreign policy. and it raises other questions. So I will just give you a few hints or ideas on theoretical discussions we can have, starting with this book. The first series of questions would be on influence and of French influence. Why, how can a state be influenced today? You establish clearly a link between the rank and the perception of universalism as a signature, you say, of France. France will be able to keep on punching beyond its weight only if it can effectively promote the value of its perceived not unilateralism, universalism, sorry. I would say this is very Macronian, although Macron is probably not aware of that, but it illustrates what he just said yesterday, which you could not know before when you wrote your book, but it has been illustrated and confirmed probably yesterday. We can come back to that. It implies also that France tries to return to multilateralism if it wants to be universalist. And so you're right, totally right, to say that we can punch above our weight only if we can play this card of universalism. But now the key to be seen as a universalist power is multilateralism. And so it doesn't depend on us alone. We don't have the keys of that. We can be seen as universalist only if multilateralism works. And it doesn't depend. It's not easy with people like Trump. It's not easy with the crisis of institutions and so on. And so you probably touch a key point on French foreign policy that does not depend on the French decision makers. We can still be seen as a useful or influent power if multilateralism works, because indeed one of the big assets of France as a power is to be seen as a multilateral universalist country. If there is no multilateralism, this will not work. Another point is that you wonder, you raise the question of how shifting global power relations can affect the influence. And so it's a question of the international system. Whatever we do, whatever we try, there is the global and regional configuration. And today the configuration is not good for a country like France. We are a state-centered country in a more and more liberal world. Europe was our buzzword and our project, and it has been reaffirmed yesterday by President Macron, but Europe is in crisis, a multifold crisis. The EU, the project of the EU is not working very well at the moment. For the moment, the answer of Macron is multi-speed Europe. Let's go on with multi-speed Europe, but it's not a very satisfying answer. It's a good attempt, but we have to see whether it works or not. And you raise also the very important question of symbolic assets versus material assets. And your hypothesis is, as you just showed us, is that France is more into symbolic assets than in material power. I'm not sure I totally agree with that, I must say, because I'm sure of one thing, is that the actors today in Paris believe the contrary. They think that we have reached the limits of symbolic power and that our symbolic power has become too symbolic to be impressive at all. And so it's time to recover rooms to maneuver. It's time to play more on material power. It's time to solve the problem of national debt. It's time to find new rooms to maneuver in terms of financial means. We have to be more present in the material power. Otherwise, this symbolic power will not last. We have reached the limits of it. It's not possible in this world to say you have to listen to us because we are friends. It has been working for a long time, but we probably reached the limits. And so the recent moments when France played a role in international relations, it was due to its material power. It was the military interventions in Mali, in Central Africa, and so on. It's the fact of being still a nuclear power with a deterrence force, and so on and so on. But we also know that this material power is probably coming to an end. or at least we have to invest a lot of money to keep it up. The nuclear deterrence will have to be modernized or disappear in the coming years, very soon. Military intervention has been a kind of big moment for France in the past years, but we don't know if we would be able to do it again. We have no idea. Could we do what we did in Mali or Libya? It's better not do it again, but could we do it again today? We are not sure. So the key is probably the material power. You're right, totally right to say that there is a symbolic power and so on, but I think this has reached certain limits. Also, there would be a lot, too many things to say, so I won't be too long because we have to take time to have a discussion. But on your main one of your main hypotheses, actually, globalization and regional integration are processes that challenge France's ability to influence international politics. So the question is, does France have less influence or capacity of collective mobilization today, or does it have still the potential to go on punching above its weight? Of course, I have many questions about that. First of all, well, of course, all those questions are absolutely right and relevant. Is it a question for France only, or is it a question for the European states in general, or is it a question for the West in general? Because after all, the same could be said of the United States and many Western countries. It's a question for Germany, it's a question for Britain, it's a question for France, for the US, for Canada. It's a question for the West. We are in a new world where emerging powers are coming with different patterns, with different beliefs, with different political cultures. And so, yes, your book is on France, so the question is absolutely relevant for France, but I'm not sure. Is it only a French question? Is it a Western question in general? Is it a European question? Or is it all that together, but more specifically French? Because French is a state-centered country in a world where state is an actor, among others, in international relations today. All the states have problems to rethink their foreign policy, their power, and their influence. So it's a question for everyone, except that France indeed is a very state-centered country who believes in states and the role of states. So when the state is in crisis, the French foreign policy is a little bit more in crisis than other countries. It's very likely and possible, but all those questions are present in the book. And there are I found many concepts of international relations that really deserve to be rethought, and you do it in the case of France, in the light of the French case. For instance, the key concept of exceptionalism or grandeur. What is it exactly? Everyone is exceptional. I mean, Russia thinks that it is exceptional. America thinks it is exceptional. Everyone thinks, we all think we are exceptional. In France, there is something different, which is this concept of grandeur. And there is a debate. Grandeur is not megalomania. It's de Gaulle coined the concept of grandeur, actually. Not as a kind of megalomaniac vision for France in the world. On the contrary, grandeur is something that can help replace the lost power. And it has been conceived as such by de Gaulle. Maurice Weiss wrote a book on a French historian on the politics of grandeur. Philippe Cerny, in English, wrote a book too. But the concept of grandeur is not greatness in the sense that we must be great and powerful. It's on the contrary, we cannot be powerful anymore, so we just have to be great. What does it mean? We have to be great in the discourse. We have to have hindsight or high-level reflection on the world. We have to be a guide. We have to be I don't know what, but we don't have the power anymore. And so, of course, I totally we remember your hypothesis on symbolic power. Symbolic power is grandeur. The problem is, how long can you last with that? Also, there is a dialectic between interests and values that can be found very deeply in your book. France plays on values and repeats and all the time and reminds us of the values. Is it incompatible with interests? I think one of the problems of the French foreign policy is that we don't want to talk about interests anymore. Nobody knows where are our interests. It's a taboo. It's like dirty, you know, to talk about interests in France today. I was very amazed after the Mali military operation in 2013 because it was a military operation that worked. Technically, militarily, it was seen as something successful. No big opposition, Russia, China, nobody put that into question. Everybody was pretty happy that French intervened against the jihadists in Mali. So apparently it was a success. The first thing that President Hollande said on TV was, of course, we are not doing that for interests. We don't have interest in Mali. So what are we doing there? Why send 4,000 troops and pay so much money if we don't have any interest in that? Of course, because we have values. Okay, but the problem is that nobody knows what are our interests anymore. We don't want to talk about interests anymore. And there is in France this opposition between interest versus values. We are here to defend values, not interests. My feeling is that this distinction, this opposition between interest and values is a nonsense. You cannot distinguish interests and values. What does it mean? Do you think we could defend our interests or in our values in a world where our interests are lost? Do you think if Nazi Germany had won the Second World War, we could be able to defend our values? No, we could not. If a dictatorial power leads the world, how could we defend our values? So I don't understand, personally, this opposition in the French public debate between interests and values, as though the interest was something dirty, value was something good. So your foreign policy defends value, not interest. Honestly, I don't see the difference between the two, because our interest is to defend our values, very simply. But apparently our value is not to defend interest. It's a problem in France. But it's a very old cultural thing in France about the interest, about material things, about money, and so on. We don't like to talk about that. And I have just a question, an open question, and then a few words on what now with Macron. And I think that Macron illustrates perfectly your hypothesis in the book, and you're right. And now we know that you're right. Just a question, what would it change to your book, to your hypothesis, your conclusions, if you bring, maybe it's a research agenda, if you bring back the study of decision process, even more in your book. If we search in details the way foreign policy is made in France in this kind of monarchy, in a way, Republican monarchy, where one man has so many powers, and would it change your your conclusions if we knew exactly how the decisions were made and taken by whom, at what time, and so on? Would it change? I have no idea. It's just an open question, but I think it would be interesting to bring foreign policy analysis and decision process analysis back even more in your book, to do like Allison in a way, so to do it again with the same question, but only with the actors and the decision process from the public policy approach. Would we have the same answer? I have no idea, but it would be an interesting experience. So what now, in a few words? Because Macron has become a kind of star in international relations because he's new, he's young, he opposed Trump, being his best friend at the same time. He opposed Putin and so on. He made a lot of speeches. So is France still a big power under Macron? Just a few words to remind or to recap a few things. First of all, the French electoral campaign was a very strange one, and the sovereignists, the anti-European, the Euroscepticals, or the nationalists had a big majority. If you take the four first candidates at the election, so Macron, Le Pen, Fillon, and Mélenchon, 3 out of 4 were more or less anti-European, very anti-European for Mélenchon, and Le Pen a little bit less for Fillon. All of them wanted to a very strong rapprochement with Russia. All of them were very anti-Atlanticists, and most of them were, in international relations, anti-liberal. Fortunately or not, depends what you think, it's the other one who won. But Macron had a little bit more than 20% in the first round. The anti-Europe, anti-NATO, anti-liberal, anti-whatever candidates gathered around 65% of the votes at the first round. So we have to keep in mind that the victory of Macron is not the pure reflection of the French mood on international relations at the moment. And I think he is making a little bit, a small mistake when he keeps repeating that people who voted for him voted for Europe. He won, finally, he won. But it doesn't mean that the French are totally pro-European. He has a vision. He has a vision that you can probably study on three kinds of documents. First is the campaign documents with three points. France should be a European power, an independent power, and something more original, a humanist power, with solidarity with the third world and with the South and so on. Then there is a global tonality of his discourse, which is clearly liberal and multilateral. And then a series of speeches, one for the conference of the ambassadors at the end of August before all the French ambassadors gathered in Paris, one at the UN recently, and yesterday's speech on Europe. So you can study, we have a beginning of a vision of what Macron's foreign policy could be, and actually there is an ambition clearly in his team. It's to invent a kind of Macronism of foreign policy. I don't know what will happen with that, but if they want to, his key word is en même temps in French, which is in the same time. And he wants to reconciliate the Gaulle-Mitterrand approach with the more Atlanticist and liberal approach, so everything is at the same time. And so it tries to coin something new, which would be kind of Macronist foreign policy, a little bit like Tony Blair tried the third way in Britain some years ago, but we all know how it ended up. I hope Macron will be more successful. With several risks. The first one is the Obama risk. I mean, many speeches that everybody appreciates, but then what? Especially with no money. So when you remember the speeches of Obama in Cairo and in Prague and so on, even the United States could not deliver after the speeches. So with our budget, I don't know how we could. So this is the first risk. Too many speeches, but then a very narrow room to maneuver. And the second risk is a Sarkozy type of risk. So too many projects, too many initiatives at the same time, always, every day. It's simply not realist. Sarkozy had this kind of project, a new project for the Mediterranean, a new project for capitalism, a new project for Europe, a new project for, and in the end, it was very difficult to impose anything. So I see that risk today, except that Macron is trying to learn from the past mistakes. He tries to prepare the initiatives much better. Obviously, he tries to learn from what has been done before. We don't know yet if it will work, but he's trying. And just a few, what will be the challenges now for, if we want your hypothesis to be true, if we want France to be still able to play a role or above or not its weight in international relations, reforms are needed in France, in the French foreign policy. Of course, it will depend on the international relations. It will depend on what happens in Africa, in North Africa. If tomorrow there is a big turmoil in North Africa, if Bouteflika dies, if something happens to the King of Morocco or whatever, we will be in deep trouble. But let's put this aside. We have to reform the tool. We have to reform the tool in France. First, we have to play the card of economic diplomacy, to bring economy and trade more into our diplomatic culture. It's not easy in France. We don't like that. We don't like that. We try. Fabius tried to encompass the international trade in the foreign affairs, but it's very hard. Then we have to play the card of ideas, external analysis. We cannot depend only on the internal state analysis of international relations. We have to have more think tanks. We have to have more academics. We have to have more external ideas to think the world, and we don't like that, because it's a state-centered country, and when you ask someone in the foreign affairs if he would be happy to have an external point of view, he's very afraid. He feels in competition. He doesn't like that. The state must have it all. But we have to reform that. And also, we have to think influence instead of repeating every day that we want to be influenced. What does it mean to be influenced? What does it mean? Influence on who to do what? We have to think about that. Today, and it will be my last word, I promise.
Please.
No. Today, what I can tell you after interviews with the decision makers and the close advisors of the president, it seems that there is a three-step process at work. The team at the Élysée Palace, apparently, if I believe what they say, and I believe what they say, of course, always, thinks that there is a necessity for a three-step process. One, we have to find new rooms to maneuver in the domestic field. We are running out of money. There is a financial constraint, there is a budgetary constraint, and we have to, first of all, to find new rooms to maneuver, and we have to show our partners that we are serious about it. In terms of debt, deficit, and so on, we have to, the first step is to be credible in the domestic reform of the country. There is, it's an old obsession in the past years, starting with Fabius, as a foreign minister some years ago. He was obsessed with the constatation, with the observation that Germany was seen in the world as the biggest European power because of its economic wealth. And this is an obsession in France. If we don't reform the country, if we are not serious about economic reform and economic health of the country, we cannot be a power anymore. The second step is Europe, because there is a conviction, a deep belief in the team at the moment that we are nothing without Europe. And we have a big problem because Europe is not in a good shape, is not in a good situation. And as long as we have not revived Europe as a project, we don't have much chance to play a role in the world anymore. And then only the third step would be to have an international agenda, to propose initiatives, peace processes. I know that the team, Macron's team, is really looking for initiatives to take that would be in our capacity. We cannot solve the Israel-Palestinian conflict tomorrow alone, for instance. No need to try. But maybe we can do something on Libya. Maybe we can find another place in the world where we could play a role. But this would be only the third step. First, reform the country and show that we are serious about it. Second, revive Europe, and only we will have an international agenda. So it's a long-term vision. Everybody in France is aware of the difficulty of the task. Everybody knows that maybe the past presidents have tried to do it the other way around. So to try to have an international agenda, an ambitious international agenda, precisely to hide the fact that Europe is not in a good situation and that France is not in a good situation, but we cannot do that anymore. So nobody knows if it will last. Maybe after 1 or 2 years of attempts, Macron will do the same as his predecessors. For the moment, he's really trying to do it the other way around. But once again, with the risks I've mentioned already, Sarkozy or Obama-like situations. But it totally shows that the questions you raise in your book are the relevant ones. It's a matter of symbolic power versus material power. It's a matter of domestic capacity of the actors versus the international situation and the regional situation. These are the dilemmas that you have pointed very rightly in your book, and that's why it's a very useful book, and I was very happy to read it. Thank you very much.
Please. Take a seat. Please come up to the podium, both of you. This was very interesting. to see it also from the French view.
Absolutely.
We will, in a minute, open up for questions from the audience. Please give me a signal if you would like to speak to either Pernille or Fredrik. I would just, I was a bit puzzled by the latest intervention, Fredrik, when you were saying many times France is running out of money.
Yes,
And
I confirm.
And I guess this is one of the crucial questions in the years to come. Will we get a new German government to pay for French economic reforms, which will be the core, maybe, of a material backbone to French power? You write about symbolic power, but in the end, international politics somehow need this material power, as was outlined by Fredrik. I would like you to comment a little bit.
Yeah,
on that.
yeah. Thank you so much, first of all, for your comments. It was really interesting comments, and I'm very glad that you have read it so thoroughly, and I'm so very happy about that. When it comes to this issue about symbolic and material power, of course, in my book I talk about symbolic power as the only way for France to play a global role, to kind of legitimize its power. But as I said also, I do not mean that France has become a normative power, but I think I link up to what you said, that in France now it's a taboo to talk about interests. But the French interests are still there. I think that the political, as I read them, the political leaders are very well aware of what are the interests. But in order to be kind of respected and have some influence, it has to be presented in a different way. So that is why they use symbolic power more strategically. But the interesting thing is that the result of that kind of change is that you see a more normative-driven policy. And I think you see it quite clearly in the French African policy, where there has been a change. Finally, a move beyond this negative connotation of France-Afrique. I mean, it's probably you can find some evidence of that still, but at least there has been a process, and this actually happened under Hollande, and I think this is something that will continue in Macron. So of course, a material power is important. France has to redress the national economy in order to be able to finance kind of its foreign policy. But I think it will continue to be legitimized by kind of references to symbolic power. And of course, they need help from Germany, but there are some changes now, also with the reforms that Macron has kind of advanced, and of course, they need help from Germany and from Europe. But don't you think that it will also be possible to have this reform going through in France? That there is a bigger kind of greater understanding that this is the only way to kind of redress the national economy. And the street manifestations have not been that...
And to follow up there, because it's very interesting to see how these middle-sized European countries, Germany and France, who's been driving the European integration process, both hang on to multilateral structures these days, but challenge multilateral structures. But maybe their goals are different. And the starting point are different, because Germany needs the European Union because they can't go it alone. But France, obvious historical reasons and maybe more value-based reasons, but France need it because, as you said, they need money, they need also a material backbone to their power. I don't know.
Well, I think nobody in France today has any hope of asking Germany to pay for the French ambitions and so on, because we know in terms of foreign policy, Germany will not do it. We don't have the same approach. We don't have the. If we ask Germany to pay for a military intervention in Africa, Germany will not do it, and we know that. So maybe we can find common actions sometimes and so on. But the key in the team at the moment is to really to reform the country, to find the money ourselves, not to ask the EU to pay for us. So I think it's a big change. because indeed in the past it was a French temptation to believe that after all the other ones we would protect Europe and the others would pay. And we know it's not the case anymore, because we don't have the same idea of protection and we don't have the same idea of responsibility. And this is something very striking to me between France and Germany. France considers that its responsibility is to intervene militarily when there is something wrong in the world. Germany thinks that responsibility is to keep calm.
Yeah. Exactly.
And not to intervene everywhere immediately. This is not responsible at all for the Germans. And so we disagree on that. So we know it in France, and we know that now we have to work with the Germans, but not just to ask money. But where we agree between material and symbolic thing is that symbolic power has a price. And in an interdependent world, if you want to be a symbolic power, you have to pay for that. And this is the problem that we have. In the past years, the diplomacy of influence was the buzzword. Find me, give me ideas to have more influence, but of course no money for that. No, we need, if you want to be influenced, you have to pay for it. If you want a big conference in Paris to invite the rest of the world, if you want a new big think tank to compete with the German foundations or to with the think tanks in London and so on, you have to pay for that. You cannot just simply, you know, this typical French sentence expression that we've heard too many times in the past years, that we have to do more with less money because we have to use money better. No, it just doesn't exist. You know, if you want to do more, you have to pay for it. So the idea that you can do more with less money doesn't work simply. And so yes, symbolic power. You're absolutely right. Symbolic power is important for France, but our problem today that we must remember that symbols are expensive.
Pernille?
I think that
Just come with the cost symbols.
sure. I think that for Macron to succeed with this symbolic power discourse, he has to succeed with national reform. So that is the first thing, and then he has to succeed with, as you said, also with the reforms agenda for Europe. And create a Europe that is more, have more positive reactions in the populations, that we actually create a Europe that delivers. Maybe his way to create a more pragmatic Europe is the way. Maybe different speed Europe is the way, if he managed to kind of make it into a concrete and make Europe deliver on kind of the different issues that he mentioned yesterday in his speech. So I think this is the two fundamental kind of things for him to succeed, that he succeed in national reform and on the European reform process. If not, France will not be able to continue to play this kind of symbolic power card. So and have this grandeur. And I think that if the election result in France had been differently, if Le Pen had actually won, I think my book would have been a history book of the Fifth Republic, maybe. But now what is interesting is that there is still some hope.
It would have been banned in France anyway.
Or even burned. Okay, we will bring in the audience. I have one question over here. Please stand up.
Yes.
You will get.
Hello, my name is Lars Ivar. I have a background in historical studies and some army background. Worked for the OTAN. And to Frederick, I'm a very modest and I think a bit pessimistic view on the French role in the world, because I think it's still very significant. And you talked about your operations in Africa, for instance. I think it's pragmatic post-colonialism, and because you have a responsibility, fragile states that can fall into disarray, humanitarian disaster. So, for instance, you have the accent direct, very capable people in the French army, doing good, Mali, all over the Sahel countries, very discreet. That's the point. Doesn't have to be in the media. A bit disaster. But I'm a bit disappointed in your stance on the Arab Spring. You hinted to that you saw that as a very sad thing. I think it is from the terms of political science, Arab Spring is a stupid concept. It was Arab Spring. Arab Spring, yes, the intervention in Libya. But I was sad that you let another great republic, a republic that hasn't been in existence as long as France, but Syria was let down, and it was sacrificed to to the Saudi Arabian kingdom and US interests, and you went along with it. I was hoping at that time that France would stand up and say, hands off Syria. Thank you.
Any comments?
Well, yeah, a very short comment, but on Syria, we are exactly at the heart of the dialectic between values and interests and capacities. Because there is a debate in France at the moment, so did we have the right stance on Syria? What happened was that we had several stances on Syria, actually. There was a big key moment in 2013 when France wanted to strike Syria and finally did not do it because the United States didn't want to do it, and then we realized that we could not do it alone, and now there is a debate. Did we manage the Syrian crisis well or not? We wanted Bashar al-Assad out of power. It was the first priority, and by repeating that, we were marginalized in the diplomatic process. So now there is a debate. Should we have been more cynical and take into account our capacities and play all the cards? Or were we right to insist on values? History will judge, and so on and so on. This is the debate in France at the moment. But we don't know exactly, we don't have the last word on Syria. There is a big debate in France, and now Macron tries to revive the Syrian issue by taking new initiatives, by proposing a conference, international conference on Syria. But the debate is very hard, very, very strong between those who think that Hollande, after all, was right to talk about values and responsibilities, even if the price was to be marginalized in the diplomatic process, and those more realist, realpolitik oriented, who think that we should have been more cynical on the Syrian case.
Pernilla, do you have any comments?
No, I think that was very well taken.
We have one question over here.
Thank you. My name is Anders. I'm from the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association. Being great is often about being seen as great. And like you said, I also believe that France's greatness is closely linked to the survival and well-being of multilateralism. But one cannot be multilateral by oneself. What does France do to convince others to play along in their multilateral desires? Because as it's seen right now, quite a few influential powers do not really want to be multilateral. Thank you.
Pernilla?
Yeah, I think that that is a very good point, and it's also not possible, of course, to play this symbolic card if not others play along. When it comes to multilateralism, I think that was a very good point that you raised as well. Well, there's no simple answer to that. One could just hope that at least there are better prospects with Macron as president in France than we would have had with Le Pen, I guess, when it comes to multilateralism. And at least to have some kind of visions and the willingness to promote the value of multilateralism and the importance of protecting the liberal order, I think that is important in itself. And of course, France is not alone promoting that. I think with his reform of the EU and making the EU stronger also, or his wish to do that together with Germany, hopefully we will see a stronger multilateral trend. And then even though we see, Trump has a different perspective, hopefully Trump will not be president of the US forever, and we can see a change again in France. So I think that at least it's but of course you're right, the multilateral order is under pressure, but I think that there is a place for a country like France to kind of push this agenda.
And probably this is exactly what we see in the European Union at the moment. We are at a crossroad, so to say. It's grown larger, more heterogeneous. If France and Germany, who has been the real driving force, can't find together and save this multilateral organization, we will be in, I guess, rather big trouble. But but the way forward, was it the speech yesterday that point out the way forward, or is it other solutions to it?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, France wants to develop and to promote multilateralism. We have to find allies for that. And the problem we have is that the biggest ally for multilateralism is not multilateral anymore. It's the United States. So that's why Macron's trying to play like damage control with Trump. Obviously, this is the strategy. He tries to keep the U.S. in, hoping that by keeping good relations with Trump, the rest of the administration in the United States would go on playing the multilateral game. But then it's not enough, and that's why he tries to have cooperation with Canada, with Germany, and so on and so on. But indeed, if we cannot be multilateral alone. So it's not lost yet, but there is a crisis of the idea of multilateralism today. And the key would be China and Russia. Sometimes they play the card of multilateralism when it's in their interest, not always.
No, that's true. Pernilla.
But I think that the danger for the multilateral or the liberal order is not only on the international level and finding allies, it's also within the society, within the European countries. I mean, the populist trend is perhaps the most important danger to multilateralism. And I think that, I mean, just 6 months ago, European politics looked very differently, and we had a lot of election where the fear was that countries, important countries like France, would also be taken over by populists. And this challenge is still there. But what is interesting with Macron's response is that he wants to do something, changes in Europe in order to make Europe stronger, in order to respond to the populists, in order to make Europe deliver or assist the different countries in creating more jobs, in making a more social Europe. So, I mean, we don't know yet if this will work, but at least there is an agenda for kind of countering the populist trend and the forces that are against multilateralism, liberal order values, or the values, at least the ones that we adhere to.
And of course, this was touched upon by Frédéric when he said that is the French decline or the French problems, current problems, only French? Or is it the whole Western order, the whole liberal order? And I don't know if you would like to respond a little bit more, go deeper into that.
Well, no, it's true that it's the limits that we can see in France and that you have studied in your book are not only the French observations. United Kingdom is in a kind of crisis. There is a big debate in the UK on we have disappeared from the world stage. We don't have any foreign policy anymore. We cannot play any role anymore because we are too we hesitate. We don't have vision. And there is this crisis, intellectual crisis, probably in the Western world today. A financial crisis, of course, since 2008, but also an intellectual crisis. We don't know exactly how to behave with the rise of the new emerging powers. We don't know if we must encourage that trend, if we want to engage those new powers, if we want to defend. There are several voices about that. Those who say that if we must be coherent, if we defend multilateralism, we must encourage the emergence of new powers. But all the countries says, yes, but look at the situation and look how it happens concretely at the UN. It's difficult to work with the emerging countries. It's difficult to work with India and China and so on. It's not the same. We cannot promote any liberal agenda. They don't like that. They don't want to cooperate with it. And so we must defend the Western liberal values against the rise of the emerging powers, which is itself in contradiction with the multilateral liberal idea. So we have a problem with that. And so it's not only a French problem, because if you take the most influent Western powers, like let's say U.S., UK, Germany, France, for instance, just to mention those ones. France has many ideas, but not a lot of means, as we already said. Germany has more means, but wants to be pretty discreet.
Not so many
and
ideas.
Not give lessons. Probably they have ideas and a real diplomacy of influence, but discreet. The UK is in a kind of disarray today, and the US is totally disorganized by Trump. I mean, the US administration in terms of foreign policy, many appointments have not been possible. There are many blank lines in the organigram of the foreign of the State Department today, because people have not been appointed or already fired 2 weeks after they've been appointed, or, and so on. So this is a crisis for the West.
And for General Kelly, let's hope he will get Trump to sort out his crisis. Do you have anything to add? Otherwise, I have 3 questions from the
Okay,
audience.
we can take
Yeah?
the questions.
Okay. Yeah.
We are making a,
You have to use the microphone
Okay.
because we are
no,
streaming.
we are making a film about the European Council because we think that is an interesting instrument, and we want your comments on how can Macron use, because he's very interested to use the European Council. Is that an instrument that can be used to strengthen the symbolic power and the real power without using so much money?
The European Council. You mean the Council of Europe?
No,
yeah?
because, but it's the question of the place and role of Europe in the French foreign policy. It's not the European Council only. It's the way I think we have to leave to stop with this typical French attitude, consisting of thinking that Europe is interesting only if it's a French tool, and we have this problem. Obviously, for years we have had this problem to consider that it was worth thinking about Europe only if Europe could support the French ideas in the world. And that the European Council was an interesting tool only if France was the leader of ideas, and the European Council was, it cannot work like that anymore.
And that also goes for the Council of Europe, as you asked about.
Yes, the Council of Europe and
the European Council.
No, but you say European Council or Council of Europe, sorry.
I think you meant the Council of Europe.
Ah, the Council of Europe.
Council of
Sorry,
Not
sorry.
the European Union.
No, the Council of Europe is not seen, I'll be very cynical, it's not seen as a tool in France. It's, it's seen as not even symbolic power, just symbolic, not power.
Okay. Okay.
Maybe we're wrong.
We have one question down here.
Richard Scarborough from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You touched upon it already, Professor Charillon, the way that EU is interesting to France as an instrument. But I wanted to ask, in the sense that you also mentioned that for France there is much at stake. There is the essential issue of rebuilding the material basis for French power. But this is also, seems to a lot of us, so much hope is pinned on the French being able to do that in order to revive the whole EU project in itself, and perhaps a little trade-off with Germany chipping in and making some concessions, provided that Mr. Macron will succeed in this endeavor. And I was very encouraged to hear that you say the French are now ready for this. There is an appreciation that you need to do it. But is there any discourse, is there any awareness that it's not just for French's sake, it's all of Europe sitting around and sort of waiting and hoping that the French will succeed?
We can do everything alone, obviously, but there is a change of heart with Macron. There has been a debate that which is very well summarized and exposed in Pernilla's book about Europe. There is a debate: was Europe a good thing for us? Did Europe give us more power, more leverage, or was it finally a bad thing for the French foreign policy, because we have to listen to everyone, we have to talk to everyone, and so on. So there was this debate, and usually the answer was, as I said before, and until Chirac and maybe under Sarkozy, Europe is an interesting tool if it goes in the sense of France. It's over. I think that Macron really understood that we could not hope this kind of thing anymore. It's a matter of survival for us, for Germany, for everyone. We have to work together. And the fact of having presented Europe as just a tool to get money, otherwise it was not something, could have been fatal for Europe, because the populism are rising, because people don't believe in Europe anymore. And after years of trying to present Europe as a kind of monster, and we had to save the country from Europe, because the politicians in France did that. Chirac was supposed to be very European, but he used to come back from Brussels every week to say that he saved the French agriculture from Brussels. And so after that, you cannot ask people to be in favor of Europe when every week you come back home to say, I saved the country from Europe. When you ask the people after that, they vote no. That's what the British did too. You cannot have a cover of The Economist every week for 20 years against Europe and then tell them that they have to vote for Europe because it's good. It's not possible. And Macron understood that. So the fact of presenting Europe as a tool only is not, it can be very dangerous. And now we have to revive the European dream and the European project. Otherwise, it will be fatal for everyone. That's the idea at the moment in France.
I know Macron is presenting Europe as a vision. Is this symbolic power?
I think it's symbolic power, but I think it's, but as I said, I think it's symbolic power used in a strategic way.
Exactly.
So I think that France hasn't left the idea of kind of, in order to play a global role, it's still through a French-led or a French-German-led Europe. And I think this is still kind of an idea, but it is presented in a different way. And I think it's talking about French power politics as a symbolic power. It's also a lot of pragmatism in French policy, and I think so that it's a bit dangerous to think that this is all about normative approach. I don't think that is true, and I think also Macron is ready. That's why he is so pragmatic when it comes to his relations with Trump. I mean, he is very clear on his principles, but at the same time also see that, as you said as well, he has to cooperate with the US. He sees the importance of that, and I think the same will go for China, for how he has also talked about the conflict in Syria, which is, the way he has talked about it is less normative than Hollande in some ways, because he has opened up for this possibility and having a solution that includes Assad and so on, which Hollande did not. So I think that it's symbolic power, but used in a, I think it's well thought through. I think it's a strategic choice. So it's not only, France has not become a normative power. That is not the same thing.
Just to follow up there, Sarkozy brought France back to NATO's integrated command, into the core of NATO. Was that symbolism? Or is it really, has it materialized in a more decisive French NATO policy? You have gone through a little bit of this in your book.
I think that the French NATO policy, I think the integration into the integrated military structures is very, very much a pragmatic choice. But it was also a choice that was made possible by the fact that the European Union had advanced in its security and defense policy, not as far as France had hoped for, but it still had progressed. And we also saw they saw that the US were less eager to maybe have that dominant role in NATO. So it was a possibility to having greater influence within. And also France was more or less integrated already. So it was, for all practical purposes, France was there as the biggest military power in Europe, contributing to most of the NATO operations and so on. So it was just a matter of, it's like Norway and the EU. I mean, we are almost in, but we will not take the final decision to be a member. But France did that to go completely into the integrated military structure, and I think that is also a result of French pragmatism, as I said.
Yeah, you explain it very well in your book already, so you should just read the chapter. But just one thing is that indeed France, it was very pragmatic, because after all we were already working with NATO a lot, and the only consequence of not being part of the integrated command was just that we were not there for decision making. So we were cooperating with NATO. NATO was the only tool in store, after all. But we were not there in the key meetings. And so we decided to. Chirac already tried, but in the mid-90s. But there was a condition: he wanted the South Command, including the Mediterranean, and thus the Middle East, and thus the Sixth Fleet, which was not acceptable for the United States. And Sarkozy was accused of having put no condition to come back into NATO, but it's not really a comeback into NATO after all. We were already working with NATO all the time.
Thank you. We have one question there. Do I have anyone else? Okay.
Thank you. It's a very timely and important book and a very interesting discussion. My name is Bjørn Skogmo. I used to be Norway's ambassador to France 2005 to the end of 2008, at the end of the Chirac years and the start of the Sarkozy years. If I understand, there has been a certain shift from a French foreign policy which used to be dominated by a conception of the national interest, perhaps more so, much more so than in my own country and in many other countries, towards a more multilateralist approach. And I think that is highly interesting, and it's important, and it's encouraging. When I was there, I tried to follow, because my background is more on the multilateral issues, and understand French position towards the multilateral agenda. And I think it was there already at the time. It was very much present in its relationship to the UN Security Council, where France, of course, is one of the P5 and one of the key players. It was also there in the G8, G7, G8 circle, and by its prolongation, which came after my time, the G20. And it's there at the Atlantic and the European level. But on the global multilateralist agenda, at least at the time, France was not very multilateralist. It was not very interested in the rest of the global multilateral agenda, the UN, all the agencies there, because much of the French positions there was left simply to the European coordination agenda. So I think when you, if I'm correct in interpreting you as a shift towards multilateralism, I think it's important to distinguish which level of multilateralism are you talking about. Thank you.
Any comments from the panel? Which level?
Yeah.
of multilateralism?
No, I think you're right. I haven't looked into that, the different kind of the French engagement in the different UN agencies and so on. But it's interesting, the UN policy, at least the proposal that has come from France in reforming the UN Security Council, which at least shows some kind of willingness to change kind of the yeah. So that is one thing. Maybe you have more to say about that.
We are not. France is not very demanding on the level of multilateralism now. I think we try to improvise, and every kind of multilateralism is good. For instance, Normandy format. The ad hoc groups. We say multilateralism, but in fact, in the teams of the president, they say dialogue. What is important is dialogue, and it's interesting because there is maybe sometimes a confusion between multilateralism and dialogue. We don't know yet, but it's a good idea that we should think about, because, for instance, we want dialogue and multilateralism, but then we want a multi-speed Europe, which means that we admit that sometimes the complete multilateralism doesn't work. So we don't have the answer yet. It's true. It's a key question indeed. What level of multilateralism, of what collective dialogue do we want? Is it just ad hoc dialogue? We want to talk to the countries that are good for us, or is it really a global one?
One question here. We will be providing the microphone.
4 minutes, we have to.
Hello, everyone. My name is Caroline Pledger. I'm a master's student in international relations, but it was an honor to follow the ambassador. And my question is on terrorism. Specifically, and quite unfortunately, France has been disproportionately plagued by domestic terrorism in comparison to other European countries. And I'm quite curious, in your remarks, you have commented significantly on domestic issues focusing on economics. Sorry, not even going to put that. So I'm just curious, could you comment, maybe it's my lack of knowledge on the subject specifically to France, but it seems as though multilateralism and an international approach to being more involved in military action and intervention at an international level, such as with NATO, is more of a focus rather than investigating and securitizing the hexagon, as it's referred to, from a domestic perspective.
Do we have any other questions among the audience? No. Then I will give you the last words because I know we will have to run to the airport train.
Yeah. No, I think that France plays both. I mean, they have an agenda of fighting international terrorism through military interventions, and the Mali operation is legitimized by to kind of prevent. Or as a counter-terrorist measure, and also with participation in Syria, of course. But there are a lot of measures also when it comes to intelligence and internal security that has been taken. And of course, France has the state of emergency, which has been upheld after this. So they have done a lot when it comes to internal security, and they're quite good at it, especially when it comes to hard security measures. What they haven't done so much is the more softer measures, de-radicalization programs, and how to kind of reconciliate a very polarized society. And that is the main challenge, but this is not starting to come. And if one compares Great Britain and France, how they have handled the threat of terrorism, it's very much hard security in France and the softer measures, both soft and hard measures in Great Britain. But now, this is my interpretation at least, that this is starting to coming in as they see that to handle terrorism or to counter terrorism, you have to also go to the roots of terrorism, not only take the problem of Syria, but also to handle the kind of social problems at home.
Professor?
No, nothing to add. No,
Nothing to
add. No, I agree. I totally. No, you know what? No, and once again, congratulations for this book, because normally when you're French and you read a book on French, you have the duty to be critical and arrogant. It's French. And I didn't find anything to be critical, so I just was very impressed by the quality of your field work too, because I guess you have met many people to write this book, and we can feel it when we read your book. So really, once again, it's congratulations, really.
Thank you so much.
I think that would be the best closing remarks I've heard. It's really been an honor to moderate this discussion, and please come safe back to Paris.
Yes,
we have to run to.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry to be so
No,
hurried.
it's how it is.